He was 22 years old the morning. Frank DeLuca pulled his green John Deere up to the edge of the north field, killed the engine, and sat there with his arms crossed over the steering wheel, looking at him like he had just set fire to his own barn. Frank did not get out. He did not even take his sunglasses off. The sun was barely up, and the dew was still heavy on the grass. And the young man was standing there in rubber boots that were 2 sizes too big because they had been his father's boots. And he was holding a rusted fence post in one hand and a roll of baling wire in the other, trying to patch a gap in the fence before the neighbor's Herefords wandered through again. Frank rolled down his window. The air smelled like diesel and fresh-cut hay, and the young man could hear the engine ticking as it cooled. "Boy," Frank said, and he always called him boy, even though the young man was 22, and Frank had known him since he was in diapers. "Your daddy knew what he was doing. You don't." He said it flat, like he was reading a weather report, like it was already decided, like the corn standing knee-high behind him was already dead, and he just had not figured it out yet. The young man did not say anything. He just stood there with the fence post in his hand and the wire digging into his palm, and he watched Frank start the engine again and drive away without another word, his tires leaving 2 clean tracks through the wet grass that would be there until noon. The farm had been his father's. Before that, his grandfather's. Before that, his great-grandfather had walked the property line with a surveyor in 1912 and paid for the first 40 acres with money he made working the railroad. There was a photograph in the hallway of the farmhouse, black and white, of the great-grandfather standing in front of a 2-bottom plow with a team of mules, wearing a collarless shirt and a hat that looked like it had been run over by a wagon. The young man's father had kept that photograph in a frame with cracked glass, and the young man had looked at it every morning when he walked past it to the kitchen. His father had died 6 months earlier. Heart attack in the north field, right where the young man was standing when Frank DeLuca drove away. He had been 54. The coroner said he was probably dead before he hit the ground. The young man had found him when he came out with coffee at 6:30 in the morning, and the mug was still in his hand when he called 911, and he could not remember dropping it until he saw the broken ceramic in the grass the next day. The farm went to him, not to his uncle in Des Moines who had not set foot on the property in 15 years, not to the bank, to him. He was 22. He had dropped out of community college after 1 semester because he could not stand being inside a classroom when the planting season started, and he had exactly $4,200 in the bank, a mortgage payment due in August, and a corn crop that was already showing signs of nitrogen deficiency because he had been too proud to ask anyone for help. Frank DeLuca was not the only one. The Monday after the funeral, the young man drove his father's truck into town to pick up feed, and he stopped at the co-op because that was where his father had always stopped, and he stood in line behind 3 men who had known him since he was born, and when he got to the counter, Jerry Voss looked at him over his glasses and said, "You selling before harvest, or you waiting until after?" He said it like he was asking about the weather, but it was not a question. It was a recommendation. "I'm farming it," the young man said. Jerry looked at the man behind him, a grain elevator operator named Carl Hendricks, who had played high school football with the young man's father. And Carl shook his head almost imperceptibly and walked out without buying anything. "Your daddy had a good setup," Jerry said. "Equipment, rotation, the whole thing. You got any of that?" The young man did not. His father's tractor, a 1982 International 1086 with a cab that smelled like his cigarettes, had thrown a rod 3 weeks before he died. The mechanic in town wanted $8,000 to rebuild the engine, and the machine dealer wanted $14,000 for a used replacement. and the young man had looked at both numbers and known that neither was going to happen. He had a pickup truck, he had a wheelbarrow, he had his father's boots and his cracked glass photograph, and a mortgage that was going to eat him alive if he did not figure something out before the bank started making phone calls. He sold the tractor, not the farm, the tractor. He called the mechanic and told him to come get it, and the mechanic gave him $3,500 for it, which was probably half what it was worth even with a blown engine. But he did not have time to bargain. He took that money and he took the $4,200 in his account, and he drove 2 hours south to a poultry auction in Missouri, where his father had once bought a laying hen for his mother as a joke, and he bought 300 ducklings. Pekin ducklings, 2 days old, yellow and loud and smaller than his palm, peeping in a cardboard box in the back of his truck while he drove home with the windows down and the radio off, trying to figure out what he was going to tell people. He did not have to tell anyone. Frank DeLuca saw him unloading the boxes in the barn, and he did not even stop his truck. He just slowed down on the county road, looked at the boxes, looked at the young man, and drove on. But Jerry Voss heard about it by Wednesday, and he showed up at the barn door on Thursday morning with a cup of coffee from the gas station and a look on his face like he was attending a funeral. 300, he said. You got a brooder set up? You got heat lamps? You know what you're doing with waterfowl? The young man had heat lamps. He had extension cords running from the house to the barn, and he had a brooder area fenced off with hog panels, and he had wood shavings 6 inches deep that he had shoveled out of the chicken coop his mother had kept before she died 5 years ago. He did not know what he was doing, but he had watched his mother raise chickens, and he had watched his father raise cattle, and he knew that animals were animals, and that if you kept them warm and fed and clean, most of them would live. They'll be in the north field by July, he said. Jerry looked at the ducklings, who were peeping loud and high and constant, a sound like a squeaky wheel spinning faster and faster. In the corn, he said. You're putting ducks in your corn? Yes, the young man said. Jerry drank his coffee. He did not say anything else. He just shook his head and walked back to his truck, and the young man heard him tell someone at the co-op later that he had lost his mind, that the grief had finally snapped something, that he was going to lose the farm and end up working at the grain elevator by Christmas. The young man heard about it from Carla Simmons, who ran the diner in town and who called him that night to tell him she had saved him a piece of pie if he wanted to come in before close. He went in. It was 9 o'clock, and the diner was empty except for Carla wiping down the counters, and she put the pie in front of him, apple with cinnamon that smelled like his mother's kitchen, and she sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee. Jerry Voss is an idiot, she said, but he's not wrong about one thing. You don't know what you're doing. I know, the young man said. Then why are you doing it? He looked at the pie. The crust was flaky and golden, and he could see Carla's flour-dusted fingerprints on the edge of the plate. Because my father would have figured something out, he said, and I'm not going to be the one who sells. Carla was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Your father helped me more times than I can count. When my husband left, when the diner was going under, when she needed someone to fix the cooler at 2 in the morning. I don't forget that. She stood up. You need anything, you call me. Not Jerry. Me. She walked back to the kitchen, and the young man sat there with the pie and the coffee and the sound of the refrigerator compressor kicking on in the back. And he thought about his father, who had never once told him he could not do something, even when he probably should not have been doing it. The first week, he lost 11 ducklings. They piled in the corners of the brooder and suffocated each other. Or they got too cold when an extension cord came unplugged in the middle of the night. or they just died, the way baby animals sometimes do for no reason you can figure out. He buried them behind the barn in a row of small holes, and he sat there in the dark with a shovel and told himself that if he lost 10%, that was 30 ducks, and if he lost 20%, that was 60, and if he lost more than that, he was going to have to go to the bank and beg, and he was not going to beg. He checked the brooder every 2 hours. He learned to hear the difference between the loud, constant peeping of healthy ducklings and the quiet, irregular chirping of ones that were failing. He learned to hold them in his hand and feel their warmth, to dip their beaks in water so they knew where to drink, to scatter feed in trays so they did not fight. By the 3rd week, he had 287 ducks left, and they were feathering out, losing their yellow down for white plumage, and they followed him around the barn like he was their mother, waddling and quacking in a chorus that sounded like a room full of rusty hinges. He started letting them out in the afternoon, into a fenced area behind the barn where they could get grass and bugs, and they would run toward him when he opened the gate, a white wave of feathers and noise, and he would stand there with a bucket of feed and feel, for the first time since his father died, like something was going right. But the corn was the problem. The north field was 40 acres, and it had been in corn for 3 years, because that was what his father had planted. And the soil was tired and the weeds were thick, and he did not have a cultivator because he had sold the tractor. And he did not have a sprayer because he could not afford one. And he walked the rows in July with a hoe, which was ridiculous, like trying to bail a lake with a teacup. And the ducks watched him from behind the fence, quacking like they were laughing. He was up at 5 every morning, his boots caked in mud and duck manure, his back aching from the hoe, and he would stand in the field at noon with the sun pounding down and think about his father, who had done this same work with a tractor and a cultivator and a sprayer, and who had made it look easy, and who had never once complained about the heat or the hours or the debt that must have been hanging over him every single day. The young man did not know about the debt until after the funeral, when he found the ledger in his father's desk, a leather-bound book with pages yellowed at the edges, filled with numbers in his father's cramped handwriting. The farm had been leveraged to the edge of collapse for 10 years. His father had kept it going by refinancing, by working side jobs, by selling timber off the back 40, by never once letting anyone see the strain. The young man sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him and the overhead light buzzing, and he understood for the first time that his father had been carrying something that would have broken most men, and that he had carried it alone, and that the young man was now carrying it too, except he did not have a tractor or a cultivator or a sprayer or any idea how to keep the bank from taking everything. He let the ducks into the corn on the 1st of August. He had been thinking about it for weeks, watching the ducks in their fenced area, watching them eat grass and bugs and anything else they could find, watching them turn the ground behind the barn into bare dirt with their constant scratching and pecking. And he had looked at the cornfield, at the weeds growing between the rows, at the nitrogen deficiency turning the lower leaves yellow, and he had thought about what ducks did to ground, and he had thought about what his father would have said, and then he had stopped thinking about what his father would have said and started thinking about what he was going to do. He built a fence around the north field with the posts he had been patching and the wire he had been saving and the help of Walt Pruitt, who showed up one morning with a post hole digger and a thermos of coffee, and did not say anything about why he was there until they had been working for an hour. "Your grandfather helped me more times than I can count," Walt said, "when my barn burned in '89, when my wife got sick, when I needed someone to co-sign a loan I had no business asking for. I don't forget that." The young man did not know what to say. He just nodded and they kept digging, and by noon the fence was up, and Walt packed his tools and drove away without another word. And the young man stood there looking at the fence and thinking about debts that did not show up in ledgers. He moved the ducks at dawn. He opened the gate behind the barn, and he walked into the north field with a bucket of feed. And the ducks followed him, 287, white birds waddling and quacking in a wave that stretched across the field. And when he stopped at the first row of corn and scattered the feed, they spread out into the rows like water pouring into cracks. And he stood there and watched them. They ate the grass first, the weeds that had been choking the corn, and then they started on the insects, the grasshoppers and the cutworms and the armyworms that had been eating the leaves, and then they started on the lower leaves of the corn itself, the yellowed ones that were already dying, and he watched them for an hour, and then 2, and then he went back to the barn and sat on a hay bale and listened to the sound of them moving through the field, a rustling and quacking that was like nothing he had ever heard before. Jerry Voss drove by at noon. He did not stop. He just slowed down, looked at the field, looked at the barn, and drove on. The young man saw him at the co-op that evening, and Jerry did not say anything. But his eyes followed the young man across the room, and the young man could feel the weight of that look, the judgment and the pity, and the certainty that this was going to end badly. The ducks stayed in the field for 6 weeks. The young man moved their water every day, hauling it in 5-gallon buckets from the well, and he scattered feed in the morning and the evening, and he walked the rows every afternoon, watching the corn change. The weeds disappeared first, eaten down to the dirt by the ducks, and then the insects, and then the lower leaves, and the corn started to grow differently, the stalks thickening, the ears filling out, the color deepening from pale green to dark green to almost blue-green, and the young man did not understand why until he read an old book on poultry farming that he found in his mother's things, a book from 1947 with a cloth cover and a musty smell, and he learned that duck manure was high in nitrogen, higher than chicken manure, higher than cow manure, and that ducks had been used for centuries in rice paddies in Asia to fertilize the soil and control pests, and that what he was doing was not crazy. It was old, older than tractors, older than cultivators, older than the kind of farming that Frank DeLuca and Jerry Voss thought was the only way to do things. He read the book at the kitchen table, the overhead light buzzing, and he thought about his great-grandfather with his mules and his 2-bottom plow. And he thought about his father with his tractor and his debt. And he thought about himself with his ducks and his fence posts and his baling wire. And he felt something he had not felt in months, something like hope, something like the first warm day after a long winter. Carl Hendricks came to the farm on a Tuesday in September. The young man was in the field walking the rows, and he heard the truck before he saw it, a grain elevator truck with the co-op logo on the door, and he watched it pull up to the fence and stop, and Carl got out, which was unusual, because Carl did not get out of his truck for anyone. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could crush a baseball, and he stood at the fence with his arms crossed and looked at the corn for a long time without saying anything. "It's corn," he said finally. "I know," the young man said. "Your father would have done the same," Carl said. And the young man did not know if he meant the corn or the ducks or something else entirely. "The bank's been asking about you," Carl said. "They called the elevator last week, wanted to know if you had a buyer for the crop." "Do I?" the young man asked. Carl looked at him. The sun was behind him, and the young man could not see his face, but he could feel the weight of the look, the same weight he had felt from Jerry Voss. but different somehow, less certain, less final. "You got a contract if you want it," Carl said. $11 a bushel, delivered to the elevator by November 1st. That's $2 over market. The young man did not say anything. He just stood there in the rows, the corn leaves brushing against his arms, the ducks quacking somewhere in the distance, and he thought about the ledger in his father's desk, the numbers in cramped handwriting, the debt that had been hanging over the farm for 10 years. "I'll take it," he said. Carl nodded. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a contract already written, already signed by the elevator, and he handed it over the fence. "Because it's corn," Carl said, "and because your grandfather would have done the same." He got back in his truck and drove away, and the young man stood there with the contract in his hand and the sun on his face, and for the first time since his father died, he felt like he was not drowning. The co-op meeting was the third Thursday in October. The young man had never been to a co-op meeting before. His father had gone every month, sitting in the back row with his hat in his hands, listening to the talk about prices and policies and politics, never saying much, never making waves, just being there, being part of something. The young man walked into the community center at 7 o'clock, wearing his cleanest jeans and a shirt his mother had bought him 3 years ago. And the room went quiet when he came through the door. There were 23 people there, farmers and elevator operators and feed dealers and the county extension agent. And every one of them turned to look at him, and he could feel the weight of all those eyes, the judgment and the curiosity and the pity. He sat in the back row, where his father had always sat, and he put his hands on his knees and waited. The meeting started with the minutes, which no one listened to, and then the treasurer's report, which no one cared about, and then the old business, which was a discussion about road maintenance that turned into an argument about who should pay for it, and then the new business, and Dale Pruitt stood up. Dale was not related to Jerry Voss, but he might as well have been. He was 70 years old. He farmed 800 acres with 3 hired men and 2 combines. And he had been on the co-op board for 20 years. And he looked at the young man with the same expression Frank DeLuca had used in July, the same expression Jerry Voss had used in August, the expression of a man who had already decided what the truth was and did not want to be confused with facts. "We got a motion on the floor," Dale said. "New membership application. Samuel Brennan, Northfield, 40 acres. He said it like he was reading a criminal indictment. "I got a problem with this," Dale said. "The boy's got no equipment, no history, no collateral. He sold his tractor and bought ducks. Ducks. In the corn. That's not farming. That's a circus act." He looked around the room, looking for support, and he found it in the faces of the older men, the ones who had known the young man's father and grandfather, and who had already decided that the young man was not going to make it. "I move we table the application," Dale said. "Wait and see what the harvest looks like, if he even has a harvest." The young man stood up. His knees were shaking, and his hands were sweating, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. But he stood up, and he walked to the front of the room, and he stood there in front of all those faces, and he did not know what he was going to say until he started saying it. "My great-grandfather bought this land in 1912, he said. He paid for it with railroad money, and he farmed it with mules, and he made it through the Depression and the Dust Bowl and 2 wars. My grandfather farmed it with a tractor, and he made it through the farm crisis of the 80s, and he never once took a dime of government money he did not need. My father farmed it with debt, and he made it through 20 years of low prices and high costs, and he never once complained, and he never once asked for help, and he died in the North Field with a cup of coffee still in his hand because he would not stop working long enough to take care of himself. He stopped. The room was silent. He could hear the clock on the wall ticking, and the refrigerator in the kitchen humming, and his own breathing, loud and ragged in his ears. I sold my tractor because I could not fix it, and I bought ducks because I had to do something. And the ducks ate the weeds and the insects, and they fertilized the soil. And the corn is standing 12 feet tall, and the ears are full, and the test weight is heavier than anything my father ever grew. And I have a contract with the elevator for $11 a bushel, and I am going to pay the bank, and I am going to fix the roof, and I am going to be here next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, because this farm is not a circus act. It is my family, and I am not going to be the one who sells. He stopped again. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was steady, and he looked at Dale Pruitt, and he looked at Jerry Voss, and he looked at Carl Hendricks, and he saw something in Carl's face that he had not expected, something like respect, something like pride. I got the dirt, he said. The question is whether I got the spine. It was something his father had said to him once, years ago, when he was 12, and he had fallen off a horse, and he did not want to get back on. His father had stood over him with his hand outstretched, and he had said, "You got the dirt. Question is whether you got the spine." The young man had gotten back on the horse. He had not thought about that moment in years, but it came back to him now, standing in front of the co-op, and he felt his father's hand in his, pulling him up. And he knew that he was going to be okay. The vote was 17-0. Dale Pruitt did not vote, and 2 other men did not vote, but 17 people raised their hands, and the county extension agent counted them, and the young man was a member of the co-op. He walked out of the community center into the October night, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke and falling leaves. And he stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the stars, and he thought about his father, and he thought about his grandfather, and he thought about his great-grandfather with his mules and his 2-bottom plow, and he knew that they were all looking down at him, and that they were proud. The harvest came in November. The young man hired a custom cutter, a man from 2 counties over with a combine and a truck, and they worked the north field in 2 days. The ducks herded into a temporary pen by the barn, quacking and flapping at the noise and the dust. The yield was 210 bushels per acre, which was 40 bushels more than the county average, and the test weight was 60 pounds per bushel, which was 5 pounds over premium grade, and the elevator paid the contract price without argument, and the young man walked out of the grain office with a check for $11,200 in his pocket, and a feeling in his chest that he could not name, something between relief and triumph and grief. He paid the bank first, 3 months of mortgage payments that brought him current, and then he paid the custom cutter. And then he bought a new roof for the farmhouse, the kind of roof his father had always talked about, but never had the money for. And then he stood in the barn with the ducks, 287 birds that had saved his farm, and he scattered feed in their pen and watched them eat. And he knew that he was going to keep them, that they were not just a 1-year experiment, that they were part of the farm now, part of the rotation, part of the legacy. Tom Rigby came to the farm the week before Thanksgiving. Tom was 83 years old. He had farmed the section south of the young man's property for 50 years before he retired, and he had known the young man's grandfather since they were boys. He drove a Buick that was older than the young man, and he parked it by the barn and got out with a manila envelope in his hand and a look on his face that the young man could not read. "Your grandfather sold my grandfather a breeding pair of chickens," Tom said. "Baird Rocks, $20. 1947. He handed the young man the envelope, and inside was a receipt, yellowed and fragile, with his great-grandfather's signature at the bottom. the same cramped handwriting that filled the ledger in his father's desk. "My grandfather always said your family knew things about farming that the rest of us forgot," Tom said. "He said your great-grandfather raised ducks in the rice before he came to Iowa, and he tried to do the same with corn. But the neighbors laughed at him, and he stopped because he could not stand the shame. But he always said it worked. He always said the ducks made the corn better." The young man looked at the receipt, at the signature, at the date, and he felt something break open in his chest, something that had been closed since his father died, something that was grief and love and understanding all mixed together. "He was right," the young man said. "It works." Tom nodded. He did not say anything else. He just got back in his Buick and drove away, and the young man stood in the barn with the receipt in his hand and the ducks quacking around his feet. And he knew that he was not alone, that he had never been alone, that his family had been doing this for generations, and that the only thing that had stopped them was the fear of what other people would say. He found the note in his father's desk the next day. He had been looking for a pen, and he pulled open the bottom drawer, the one he had never opened before, and he found a wooden box, handmade, with dovetail joints and a brass latch, and inside was a stack of cash, $2,300, and a note in his father's handwriting, the same cramped letters as the ledger, as the receipt, as the signature on the deed that had been filed in 1912. "For when the bank says no," the note said. "For when you think you have nothing left, for when you need to remember that you are a Brennan, and Brennans do not quit." The young man sat at the desk with the box in his lap and the note in his hand, and he cried for the first time since his father died. Not the quiet tears he had shed at the funeral, but deep, racking sobs that shook his whole body, that came from somewhere so far inside him he did not know he had it in him. He cried for his father, who had carried so much alone, who had kept this box hidden for years, who had planned for failure even as he worked for success. He cried for his mother, who had died too young, who had never seen him become a farmer. He cried for his grandfather and his great-grandfather, for all the Brennans who had worked this land and kept it going through wars and depressions and droughts and floods, who had passed it down from hand to hand like a torch that could not be allowed to go out. And he cried for himself, for the boy who had stood in the north field with a fence post in his hand and a roll of baling wire, who had been told he did not know what he was doing, who had proved them wrong, not because he was smart or brave or special, but because he was stubborn, because he was a Brennan, because he could not stand the thought of being the one who let the torch go out. He fixed the roof that winter. He hired a crew from town, and they worked for 2 weeks in the cold, stripping off the old shingles and putting on new ones, and the young man helped them, carrying bundles up the ladder, hammering nails, his hands numb and his nose running and his heart full of something that felt like peace. He bought a used tractor in the spring, not a new one, not even a good one, but a 1995 Case IH that leaked oil and needed a new clutch, and he fixed it himself in the barn with a manual he borrowed from the library and tools his father had left behind. And he learned to weld so he could patch the exhaust, and he learned to rebuild a carburetor so it would start in cold weather. And by planting season, he had a machine that ran, that pulled a plow, that made him feel like a farmer again. He kept the ducks, 300 of them now, because he had bought more in the spring, and he rotated them through the fields, corn 1 year, soybeans the next, and the soil got richer, and the yields got higher, and the bank stopped calling, and the neighbors stopped laughing, and Frank DeLuca actually waved at him one morning in June, a small nod of the head that was not quite respect, but was closer to it than contempt. The co-op voted him onto the board in his 3rd year. He was 25 then, the youngest member by 30 years, and he sat in the meetings and listened to the talk about prices and policies and politics, and he did not say much, but when he did speak, people listened, because he had proved something that most of them had forgotten, that farming was not about equipment or chemicals or scale. It was about paying attention. It was about working with the land instead of against it. It was about remembering the old ways and adapting them to new problems. He talked about the ducks at the state fair one year at a panel on sustainable agriculture, and a reporter from the Des Moines Register wrote a story about him, and the story got picked up by a national magazine, and suddenly people were calling from all over the country, asking about integrated duck farming, about using waterfowl for pest control and fertilization, about whether it would work with rice or wheat or vegetables, and the young man answered their questions as best he could, and he sent them copies of the 1947 book he had found in his mother's things, and he told them about his great-grandfather, who had tried the same thing and been laughed at, and who had stopped because of the shame, and who had been right all along. He married Carla Simmons in his 4th year. She had been saving him pie since the night he bought the ducks, and she had been saving him more than that. She had been saving his sanity, his hope, his belief that he was worth something. And they stood in the north field in September, with the corn standing tall behind them, and the ducks quacking in their pen and the sun setting over the horizon, and they said their vows with the smell of soil and manure and harvest in the air. And the young man knew that his father would have liked her, that his mother would have loved her, that his great-grandfather would have approved of a woman who could bake a pie and fix a tractor and stand up to Jerry Voss in the co-op meeting when he tried to block the young man's membership renewal. They had a daughter the next year, and they named her Ruth after the young man's mother, and they put her in a sling on his chest when he walked the fields, and the ducks followed them like a parade, and the neighbors who had laughed 3 years ago now brought casseroles and baby clothes and offers to babysit, because that was what communities did. They laughed at you until you proved them wrong, and then they pretended they had been on your side all along. The farm grew, not in acres. The young man never bought more land, but in depth, in health, in richness. The soil that had been tired and yellow and full of weeds became dark and loose and full of worms, and the corn that had been struggling to make 100 bushels an acre now routinely made 220, and the ducks that had been an experiment became a tradition. 300 birds every year, rotated through the fields, their manure building the soil, their appetite controlling the pests, their presence a reminder that farming was not a war against nature but a conversation with it. The young man kept the receipt from Tom Rigby in a frame on the wall of the farmhouse, next to the photograph of his great-grandfather with his mules, and he kept the wooden box from his father's desk on the mantel, and he kept the ledger in the drawer where his father had kept it, and sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the baby was asleep, and Carla was reading in bed, he would take out the ledger and read the numbers, and he would feel his father's hand on his shoulder, and he would know that the debt had been paid, that the torch was still burning, that the Brennan farm was going to be there for Ruth, and for Ruth's children, and for their children after that. Frank DeLuca died in the young man's 6th year on the farm. Heart attack, same as the young man's father, same field, same time of morning. And the young man found him because he saw the tractor sitting idle in the south field, and he knew something was wrong. And he ran across the property line and found Frank on the ground, already gone. And he called 911 and sat with the body until the ambulance came. And he did not think about the morning. Frank had told him he did not know what he was doing. He just thought about a man who had farmed his whole life and died doing what he loved, and that was something worth respecting. At the funeral, the young man stood in the back of the church, and Jerry Voss came up to him afterward and shook his hand and said, "Frank was wrong about you. I was wrong about you. Your father would have been proud." The young man did not say anything. He just nodded. And he went home to the farm, and he stood in the north field with the corn rustling around him, and the ducks quacking in the distance, and the sun warm on his face. And he knew that his father was proud, that all of them were proud, the generations of Brennans who had worked this land and kept it going, who had passed the torch from hand to hand, who had never let it go out. He was 30 years old when he bought back his father's tractor. The mechanic who had bought it from him 6 years earlier had never fixed it, had just let it sit in his yard, rusting, and the young man saw it one day when he was driving past, and he stopped, and he bought it for $500, less than he had sold it for, and he hauled it home on a trailer, and he and Carla worked on it in the barn for 6 months, rebuilding the engine, replacing the cab, painting it the same red it had been when his father bought it new in 1982. They did not need it. They had the Case IH. They had the ducks. They had a system that worked. But the young man wanted it, needed it, the way he needed the photograph and the ledger and the receipt and the wooden box, because it was a connection, a thread that ran from his father to him to Ruth, from the past to the present to the future. And because it proved something that the laughter and the doubt and the fear had tried to hide, that he was a farmer, that he was a Brennan, that he had known what he was doing all along, even when no one else believed it. The tractor ran on the first pull when they finished it. The young man sat in the cab, which smelled like fresh paint instead of cigarettes, and he started the engine, and he drove it out of the barn and into the north field, and the ducks scattered in front of him, white feathers and quacking noise, and Carla stood at the fence with Ruth on her hip, and Ruth waved, and the young man waved back, and he knew that this was the moment, the one he had been working toward since the morning Frank DeLuca drove away, since the night he buried the first 11 ducklings, since the afternoon he stood in front of the co-op and said he had the spine. This was the harvest, not the corn, not the check, not the contract, but this, the tractor in the field, the family at the fence, the farm alive and growing and waiting for the next generation to take the torch and carry it forward. He sold his tractor and bought 300 ducks, and they laughed until the corn harvest, and then they stopped laughing. And then they started asking questions, and then they started copying him, and then they started respecting him, and then they started telling stories about him, the young man who had saved his farm with ducks, the Brennan boy who had proved them all wrong, the farmer who had remembered what everyone else had forgotten. And he stood in his field, season after season, year after year, with the soil dark and rich beneath his boots, and the corn tall and green around him, and the ducks white and loud and alive, and he knew that the laughter did not matter, that the doubt did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was the work, the land, the legacy, the torch that burned in his hands and would burn in Ruth's hands and in her children's hands. As long as there were Brennans to carry it, as long as there was dirt to farm, as long as there were ducks to turn the soil and eat the weeds, and remind him that the old ways were not gone. They were just waiting for someone stubborn enough to bring them back. If you have ever been told you are too young, too small, or too stubborn to make something work, you are not alone. There are a lot of us out here, standing in our fields with fence posts in our hands and ducks at our feet, proving them wrong one row at a time, one season at a time, one harvest at a time. Leave a comment. Tell your story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the laughter stops when the corn grows, and the doubt dies when the ducks thrive. And the only thing that lasts is the dirt and the spine and the stubborn, beautiful refusal to quit.